Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to More Conversations. With us again is Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2016, before the presidential election, Richard wrote an important best-selling book entitled A World in Disarray, in which he elaborated a challenging foreign policy inbox for the new president. His words proved to be prophetic. Today, under Donald Trump, we face a planet in distress that it appears we cannot manage. Trump continues to belittle and weaken NATO. We see a U.S. retreat from traditional alliances. He brands the EU as a foe of the U.S. policies that are harming U.S. power and credibility in Europe. We see the U.S. breaking a string of commitments, ranging from the Iran nuclear deal to the Paris Climate Accords to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have helped change China's aspirations. There is the failed negotiation with North Korea, a failed Brexit, where an ambivalent Britain has checked out without leaving. Then there are renewed tensions in the Middle East with stunning reversals in U.S. policy on Israel, a political cloud over the presidency at home. In fact, we wonder whether the sequel to Richard's book may be entitled A World Spinning Out of Control. All seems pretty bleak, but perhaps Richard can cheer us up with his take on how we're doing. I'm delighted to welcome you to the program.
Good to be here, though my ability to cheer you up is probably finite.
All right, well, we'll see. Let's go back to 1991, a rosier period. You were in the government. The Cold War was over. Soviet Union had disintegrated. You and your colleagues in the government had evicted Saddam Hussein from Iraq. There was supposedly a Pax Americana. China was turned inwardly. Russia seemed to be completely on its back. And now things were pretty much under control. What's happened since?
Well, my guess is, Jim, a lot of historians are going to ask that question. How over 3 decades did the United States go from that almost unprecedented primacy to where we are now? And to some extent, I think the answer will be drift. To some extent, it's simply structural changes. It's not our fault, quote unquote, that say China rose. It's not our fault that these various global challenges from cyber to climate came along, for which there were no obvious or easy answers. But I do think we added to it. I think we added to it with overreach, and I believe the 2003 Iraq War will be mightily criticized for what we tried to do. And then I think under President Obama, the problem was more one of underreach, what he wouldn't do with Ukraine or wouldn't do with Syria, even after the Syrians used chemical weapons. And under Mr. Trump, it's more a continuation of Mr. Obama. Ironically enough, probably to a degree neither would be totally comfortable with. But we've added to it now, as you went in your introduction, added heavy dimensions of a lack of predictability, a lack of reliability. The United States has gone in a pretty short time from being the principal architect and general contractor of global order to now being the principal disruptor.
Trump seems to view our alliances as a handicap, entangling alliances. Absolutely. It's a policy of withdrawal. Does that make any sense?
It doesn't make sense, but he believes it. This is not opportunism. I've known him for a while. I spoke to him during the campaign, and he believes that fervently, that the costs of America's world role, the costs of American alliances far outweigh any benefits. He believes allies are free riders. He believes trade agreements are bad. He believes all these things passionately, and no argument, no marshaling of historical evidence will dissuade him from it. But you're right in the sense that there's a real cost for this point of view. Alliances have been great multipliers of American influence. We're far more capable multilaterally and collectively. It helped us win the Cold War. Now it could help structure how we deal with challenges from North Korea to Iran to climate change, you name it. But for the most part, not all the time, this administration has eschewed a policy of working with others.
Well, it seems to have retreated from 2 things. One is engagement, which is sort of a traditional tool of diplomacy, and the other is from the facts, because the statements are made that this is costing us billions and billions of dollars, and we get nothing for it. And we know that that's demonstrably not true. It's incontestably not true.
It's demonstrably not true, and it's part of a larger narrative that we're seeing on both sides of the political spectrum. It's almost reminiscent of the old guns versus butter debate. The idea is that we're spending a lot on guns, that's wasteful, and that if we were only spending less on foreign policy and defense policy, then everything would just be fine here at home. And what people who argue that point of view, including but not limited to the president, you see it on the other party, in the Democratic Party as well, they exaggerate how much we spend. As much as we do spend, as a percentage of GDP, what we now spend on defense is roughly half the Cold War average. And last I checked, we did pretty well during the Cold War economically. We do need a stable world if we're going to do well here at home. The oceans around us are not moats. We will pay a price if there's disarray, to use my favorite word, in the world. We learned that the hard way on 9/11. And you can't blame our domestic shortcomings on what we do in the world. You can't blame the state of LaGuardia Airport here in New York, or the fact that K through 12 schools in so many parts of this country are substandard, and young Americans are not getting the education they need and deserve. You can't blame all the flooding in parts of the United States because our infrastructure is inadequate. You can't blame these things on what we're doing overseas. You can blame them on what we're not doing here at home, and that ought to be the debate we're having.
Well, and that's attributable certainly to the polarization of our society and the gridlock in Washington. And what's the remedy for that?
I think you're right. When remember the old Pogo cartoon, "We have met the enemy and he is us"? I think it's true. I think we're increasingly in our own way to do what we need to do to deal with domestic challenges, whether it's entitlements, whether it's the debt, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is education, whether it's agreeing on a 5G system or
healthcare.
Or healthcare, just to name a handful of things. And
you wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And indeed, if we're to engage in nation building, where we've been an abysmal failure in Afghanistan and Iraq, it would appear, we should talk about nation building at home.
Well, we should, and we need it because we need to generate the resources. We need it for our competitiveness in this highly competitive world. We need it so we can set an example that others will want to emulate. It truly bothers me that people will point to a China for all of the waste, for all of the corruption, for the lack of freedom, and they'll say, well, maybe that's a better way to go than the United States, because in the United States they shut down government. They can't get things done anymore. They can't tackle big challenges, and that to me is a real tragedy. It's a tragedy of our own making. The good news, it could be something we could reverse. We have it within our reach. If we want to do something about it, the question is whether we will.
Well, a top-down system is unquestionably more efficient. I mean, if Xi Jinping wants to build a highway, it gets built. There's no environmental impact statements. There's no protests about minimum wage. There's none of the problems you'd have here, or the regulatory problems.
It's more efficient, but it's also much more prone to error. You had the one-child policy, and now China is reaping what it sowed. It's demographically unbalanced, and the ratio of people of working age to retirement is going to be a real problem. Well, you're right. They built an awful lot of roads in a lot of communities that they didn't need, and look at the environmental damage they caused. So civil society, democratic checks and balances, yeah, they make us less efficient. You're the lawyer, not me. Was it Brandeis who said that the purpose of American government is not efficiency? At times we want to be inefficient. We want to make sure these other considerations are factored in. We've just raised it to a level of dysfunctionality.
Well, he also said that the states should be the laboratories where we test new ideas and new policies, and I don't see that we're doing that either. So.
Well, we did it years ago on welfare reform. You're seeing it with elements of Medicaid at reform at the state level. We're seeing infrastructure banks in some cases regionally. My guess is more and more when people turn away from Washington, they're going to turn to states and cities. They're going to turn to the private sector.
Some of the answers are within the control of the executive branch, unquestionably. Let's look at the fine art of diplomacy, which
yes.
we have centered in the State Department. What has happened with Trump's State Department? I mean, the budget's been cut by 1/3. Diplomats, seasoned diplomats have left. Ambassadorial appointments remain unfilled or unconfirmed. I mean, what needs to be done there?
Everything you say is true and worse. We've also lost some of the incoming classes we'd normally have. Applications are way down. We've in some ways sent the message that to be a public servant in general, to work for government, to be a diplomat is not valued work. It was never the kind of work where people were going to do it for the stock options, but it had something to do with the satisfaction and the prestige and the fact that you're going out there and you were doing good things and making a difference. And I think we sent the message that that's not the case. I believe history will be properly, brutally critical of Rex Tillerson for his tenure as Secretary of State, for what he did to, not with, but to the State Department. And I'm sorry to say that things have not improved nearly as much as they could or should under Mike Pompeo. To some extent, the problem is the White House, which hasn't been giving the resources. But I don't see the State Department making the regeneration of its own capabilities anything like the priority it needs to be.
But what about the Trump approach that diplomacy should be based on personal relationships at the very top?
All presidents are prone to that. I remember before my time, but I've read about it, FDR thought he could bring Stalin along, and other presidents thought that their personal relationship or chemistry could make a difference. And it makes a difference, but in my experience, at the margins. Maybe the last couple of percent of a relationship, but 95% or more of a relationship is based on old-fashioned, hard-headed national interests. And personal diplomacy is exaggerated, and this president's gotten into really deep water when he wades into summits unprepared, and he thinks that somehow chemistry and personal diplomacy are going to save the day. And what we've seen in the two summits with North Korea, or the summit with Russia, with Russia's Putin, that personal diplomacy didn't count for anything.
Well, let's take North Korea. We've had two summits now. They've both failed. Is it that Trump was naive in thinking that he could sweet-talk Kim Jong-un into giving up his nukes? Or was he simply short-sighted in thinking that by force of personality he could get the desired result?
Or all of the above. But to set as your goal something you are highly unlikely to be able to achieve is setting yourself up for failure. In my analysis, North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons. It may commit in principle to denuclearization, but it doesn't mean to carry it out. The only reason you and I are talking about North Korea, or the president's meeting with his counterpart, is because they have nuclear weapons and missiles. North Korea saw what happened to Ukraine and others when they gave up their nuclear weapons. They're not going to repeat the same mistake. And Libya. So when we talk to North Korea, as we did reportedly before the Hanoi summit, about the Libya model, that they have to give up all their nuclear weapons and missiles and fuel and give it to us.
Then we'll talk.
Yeah, this is crazy. This is setting yourself up for failure. Look, we've got a serious decision to make with North Korea, which is, are we prepared to accept lesser outcomes? We're not going to solve this problem anytime soon, if ever. But we maybe can put a ceiling on it, and we maybe can reduce the scale of the problem. So are we prepared to offer a degree of sanctions relief for North Korean steps short of denuclearization? That, to me, is the basis of a serious foreign policy conversation, potentially of a serious negotiation. But if we continue to insist on all or nothing, all of North Korea's nukes and missiles need to go before they would get anything from us, we're going to end up with nothing except a much larger North Korean arsenal. And by the way, that's what we have now. We now are facing a larger arsenal after 2 years than we had when this president became president.
And didn't the summit really give Kim Jong-un a place at center stage in the world, something which North Korea had never enjoyed before? It used to be a rogue state with
people say
propped
that
up by China.
Look, I don't mind that much. I've never thought of diplomacy as a gift. I've always thought of diplomacy as an instrument of national security. I'm prepared to sit down and talk with North Korea if I think there's a reasonable chance of getting what it is, or degree of what it is we want as a result. So to me, the fault is not in sitting down with North Korea. It's rather in raising expectations and in raising our goals to a level that simply cannot be met.
Now, what about Trump's apparent willingness to be chummy with authoritarian figures around the world, with Bolsonaro of Brazil, with Erdogan, with Putin, and of course, the top of the list almost is MBS in Saudi Arabia.
Well, look, you're right to point it out. It's too complete of a pattern to ignore it. These are not one-offs. There is a pattern, and one contrasts it with the relatively poor relations, say, with Canada, with much of Europe. So obviously the ability to get along with democratic leaders seems to be less than it is to get along with authoritarians. I think it's part of a larger problem for this administration, which is the moral, ethical, the democratic, human rights dimensions of American foreign policy have almost been totally missing. This has in many ways become an amoral foreign policy. The one exception I've seen to that, and it's a welcome exception from my point of view, is in Venezuela, where ironically enough, we're actually acting multilaterally, and there seems to be a bit of principle informing what it is the United States is for and what it is the United States is against. But that seems to be the exception. In the rest of the world, we're not really talking about democracy, and we seem much more comfortable working with authoritarians than we do with Democrats.
Let's look for a moment at Saudi Arabia. And the news today is that the security officer of Amazon, or of Jeff Bezos, says that Saudi Arabia may have had a hand in the hacking of Bezos' telephone. Now, suppose that turns out to be true. What does that mean in terms of the foreign relations of the United States? I mean, we're the only country that has failed to join the international outcry over the murder of Khashoggi. And meanwhile, we're prepared to give nukes to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it all seems like a very strange situation.
Even if it's not true, and I hope it's not, though it very well may be, it feels like it could be true. I'm reminded of what a previous Secretary of State once described. The United States needed called for an agonizing reappraisal of a difficult foreign policy relationship. I think the time has long since come for the United States to have an agonizing reappraisal of its relationship with Saudi Arabia. We keep using the word close ally. Well, it's not. It's prosecuting this truly ill-advised war in Yemen. It's moved against Qatar. It moved against the Prime Minister of Lebanon. Historically, though less so recently, it's been a major supporter of global terrorism. It killed an innocent journalist in the Turkish consulate in Istanbul, and may have now done what you suggest they may have done vis-a-vis Mr. Bezos, violating his privacy. So why do we think Saudi Arabia is this great ally that's always going to work on behalf of interests that align with ours? Why would we want to sell them any of the prerequisites of a nuclear weapon is beyond me. So no, I think, again, it's getting to something you talked about before. This is the danger of allowing personal relationships, and the fact that the president or others at the White House may feel comfortable with this or that Saudi leader. So what? We ought to have a much more hard-headed transactional approach to Saudi Arabia.
Well, is part of it, in terms of the attitude of the Trump administration, sort of the attitude represented by Jared Kushner, that it would be great for Israel if Saudi Arabia allies with Israel and allies with other Arab states against Iran?
Sure, it would be great for Israel if Saudi Arabia were willing to make peace with Israel, but I see no evidence that Saudi Arabia is willing to do that. The idea that the Saudis are going to somehow deliver the Palestinians to a peace with Israel seems to me to be as far-fetched as anyone would get. The Saudis are not going to do that. A lot of their legitimacy depends upon how they are seen to protect the interests of the Islamic world. I think there's no way they're going to risk that position. We also have to be careful they don't get us into a war with Iran. Saudi Arabia has its own agenda. It's not necessarily the same as ours. So this administration needs to be careful not to exaggerate what Saudi Arabia is going to deliver on the quote-unquote peace process. It has to be much more careful about what Saudi Arabia might engineer when it comes to a confrontation with Iran.
And what about the Trump administration's approach to Israel-Palestine? There have been two startling decisions recently, one moving the embassy, as you know, and the other recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights. Those moves have been viewed as arrogant in the Middle East. The head of Brookings in the Middle East told me he thought it was arrogant. I mean, do you think this was well advised?
Arrogant is the least of the adjectives I just, look, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for what? What do we get for it? Answer is nothing. So why would you play a card that is as controversial and as big as that and get nothing for it? And why would you do it isolated from a peace process rather than as maybe the culmination or the missing 5 or 10% at the end? So it seems to me it was a fundamental misplaying of diplomacy there. And then to essentially recognize Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights. Again, for what? No one was saying Israel ought to give back the Golan Heights now. That's not on the agenda. But to agree to the annexation, what do we then tell the Russians about Crimea? What do we then say to Israel when this encourages people in Israel to say, well, great, we just annexed the Golan Heights, the Americans bought into that. Next it's the West Bank. And then what? So what we are
Well,
going
they
to
do say that. They say that right now.
Exactly. So what? So what does it mean then to be supportive of Israel? Why do we think this kind of unconditional support is necessarily good for Israel? If Israel ends up forever holding on to these territories with all the people in them, how does Israel remain a secure, prosperous, Jewish, democratic state? I don't see how. Something has to give. So this administration, with its uncritical embrace, I believe is actually encouraging actions by Israel or by Israelis that in the long run offers or constitutes something of a threat or a challenge to Israel's long-term viability as a Jewish, democratic, prosperous, peaceful country.
So does that mean the two-state solution is dead?
It's not dead, but it's on life support. And a two-state solution is not a favor the United States or Israel would be doing for Palestinians. I believe it's essential for Israel's own long-term viability. So I would be taking steps, if we couldn't bring about the two-state solution now, and I don't think we can, I would be taking steps to preserve the option down the road.
Okay, so let's move on to China, which you've
Something
said,
easier.
Something easier. You've said that China was, managing China was the most important relationship of the 21st century. And now we're in the middle of a trade war. Who knows how that's going to play out? Where do you see our relationship with China is going?
Since the last time I was on your show, this relationship has deteriorated badly. I'm hard-pressed to think of a major policy that has changed so far, so fast than the U.S.-China relationship. It's gotten much worse, partially because of trade, partially because of what's going on inside China as China becomes more repressive, partially as China adopts a more assertive foreign policy. But now people are either saying a Cold War is inevitable or a Cold War has already broken out. You now have the reconstitution of the Committee for the Present Danger, though instead of the Soviet Union, people are now saying China constitutes the 21st century adversary of the United States. I'm not saying any of that's impossible. That could happen. But it's a much different, and I believe, much worse 21st century if the United States and China end up in a Cold War or worse. So I would try to make a priority, if I were influencing things, about how do we prevent that from happening? How is it that we try to steer U.S.-Chinese relations in a direction where our interests are protected and where at least we preserve the possibility of selective cooperation, whether it's vis-a-vis North Korea or climate or some other issue. You mentioned one thing in the beginning, which was TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One of the areas of real strategic incoherence in American foreign policy under this president is he has rightly, I believe, criticized China, particularly on the trade front, as constituting much more of a challenge than Americans were prepared to admit. But then he denied himself the single most effective tool the United States had for dealing with that challenge, which was participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Well, he's trying to get back in.
I haven't seen that.
You haven't seen that?
No,
so
sir.
China wants to get into the TPP. And
well, again, I would be all in favor of China getting in on terms that force China to raise its game. What I don't want us to do, in some ways like we did with the WTO, is to allow China into regional or global institutions and allow them to take advantage of that.
But China has been a bad actor in trade, hasn't it?
Absolutely. They have stolen technology. They have kept up certain tariff and non-tariff barriers. They have required technology to be transferred as a condition for investment. Historically, they may have done some manipulation of currency. So yeah, there's a legitimate set of complaints. And again, this administration deserves some credit for calling China out on it. The real question now is, can they go from that criticism to locking in a deal that does something effective about it? And I'm hoping they can.
You think Trump will make a deal with China?
I think we will. The real question is, how ambitious is it? Does it deal largely with surface things like trade imbalances, which don't particularly matter? And does it deal much more with some of the structural challenges of doing business with China? And the question is how much we hold out for.
Okay, so we have to wrap up, and I have a question for you. We've pretty much outlined a world in great disarray, greater disarray than you prophesied even in 2016. Where do you think we're going?
At the risk of leaving people in even worse mood than they began the show, I don't see any big turnaround. I think this is a period of growing disarray around the world. It's not going to be the post-American world will not be a Chinese world. It won't be a Russian world. It won't be an anybody world. I think it'll just be a messier world where the gap between global challenges and global responses will grow. We'll probably have continuing turmoil in the Middle East. populism, nationalism showing up in places like Europe. I think the biggest single factor in how the world turns, if you will, over the next 5 to 10 years will be the United States. What is it are we prepared to do? Are we prepared to assume or reassume something of our traditional role of a global leader, or we continue to be something of a disruptor and sitting things out? We have got to try to make the world a more stable place, a more prosperous place, a more orderly place, not as a favor to the world. It's not, foreign policy is not philanthropy. It is an extension of what's good for us at home. We will only thrive as a country in terms of security, in terms of prosperity, if the world is stable. That, to me, is the principal lesson of modern history. But the world won't get stable without us. So we have got to help make it stable, again, in part as serving our own interests here as home, as well as helping the world and helping others out there.
Very well said. The world will not get stable without us. Richard Haass, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.